Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second session on our seminar on environmental and human features in the age of the Anthropocene, which is a joint event between the University of East Anglia and the Federal University of Pelotas. And we are very glad to have here among us today Dr. Marina Pereira, who is going to be our speaker for the session today. And I'm going to briefly introduce her, and then, as usual, we'll have her talk, and then afterwards we'll have perhaps the best part of Q&A, in which you can have an interesting discussion, much to the likes of what we had last time. So, Dr. Pereira has a doctorate in comparative literature from the Federal Universidade Federal Fluminense in Rio de Janeiro, and she's currently a professor of literary theory at the Federal University of Rio Grande, which is very close to where I am, luckily. She's been doing research for quite some time now on climate fiction and the Anthropocene, and I'm sure that her talk today is going to be very interesting in converging to the main topics of this event. So, without further ado, Marina, thank you very much for accepting the invitation of being here with us today. And the ground is yours. The floor is yours.
Oh, okay. So hello everyone. I would like to start thanking Eduardo and Karina for the invitation to participate in this event. It's an honor to be able to talk with all of you here about my latest research. And well, I will just start. Hope you like it. Well, Eduardo, you're going to pass the slides, right? Yeah. Okay. You can stay there for now. So there is this talk that I'm going to give today is called Haunted Landscapes, Eco Horror in Contemporary Latin American Fiction. And I've started to think about that because it seems, actually, there is a rising trend in contemporary Latin America literature that undeniably presents a collective cohesion, as some researchers noted already. Referring to the horror literature of writers such as Mariana Enriquez, Samantha Schweblin, Monica Ojeda, Fernanda Melchor, Maria Fernanda Buero, among others. The trend, as one of these researchers, Andrea Araújo, points out, is not exactly new and has already been identified by several journalists and researchers in recent years. However, Araújo draws attention to a relevant issue by revisiting a text by Mariana Enriquez called Creating a New Tradition of Latin American Horror, in which she discusses how the lack of tradition here comes from a kind of erasure of local beliefs and monsters perpetuated by our process of colonization. In her search to find an Argentinian horror, Enriquez realized that the first local horror text she had ever read were the testimonies of the Argentinian dictatorship. So, based on Enriquez's reflection, Araújo then suggests that the collective cohesion we perceive in Latin American horror literature consists of the shared violences we experience. And Eduardo, could you pass the slide, please? I brought here a quote from Araújo that I'm going to read with you. And it says that what is truly horrifying, the inconceivable within a so-called nature order of things, is dictatorship, colonialism, slavery, the oppression of gender, sexuality, and class, social and urban inequality, the constitution of the bourgeois family. Everything we consider part of our daily life, of the Latin America condition, is fictionalized through the lens of horror in order to express a kind of experience that denaturalizes what is presented to us as part of reality. So, based on this violence collectively experienced throughout Latin America, a range of this fiction has focused on another trend in contemporary literature, that is, bringing the ongoing environmental crisis which is a direct consequence of the horrors mentioned by Araújo that haunt the global south. And this literature seems to bring this environmental crisis to the core of the narrative, most of those horror narratives. So it is in this context that the works that I'm going to analyze in this presentation are situated. We are going to talk about today about three books. We have here Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, and Os Substitutos by Bernardo Carvalho, which in English would be The Substitutes, but it doesn't have a translation yet. It's a book from 2023. So although they come from different horrors, all those books, we have here agrochemical horror, scientific paradoxes horrors, and military dictatorship horrors. They all deal with common anxieties of the Anthropocene in its resulting crisis, and more specifically, they confront the consequences of the horrors perpetrated in the pursuit of modern progress. So, to speak about this horror in Latin America, a trope that is quite often presented in Gothic aesthetics will guide my reading, and that is the ghost. this spectral presence which never seems to fully materialize and haunt everything around it. Here, this ghost is quite peculiar. Also, it is a local ghost, we could say that, and a ghost of our times, of the Anthropocene. And perhaps because of that, all the more diffuse and difficult to grasp given the magnitude and scale of the crisis we currently face. So the three works selected for analysis, one Argentinian, one Chilean, and one Brazilian, deal to a great extent with this idea of incompleteness inherent to the ghost trope. And although each addresses issues particular to its historical and cultural context, the ongoing environmental crisis of the Anthropocene emerges as a ghost haunting characters, their relationships, and the place they inhabit. So these elements of Gothic aesthetics, so to speak, seem to arise to intensify maybe the particularity, or I could say, maybe they seem to arise to intensify the dark reality of our times. Eduardo, could you pass the slide, please? As the editors of Dark Scenes from Damaged Earth argue, and I quote them, "For in Gothic, as in the Anthropocene, we will claim the boundaries between fiction and reality blur to the extent that each interpenetrates and shapes the other, dismantling conventional patterns of differentiation." So here in this book, they suggest then that perhaps the Gothic aesthetics allows literature to say something about the climate crisis of the Anthropocene that conventional and realist narratives may not be able to, especially given that the epoch itself has been defined, they argue, by terms such as dark ecology, referencing Timothy Morton's work. So in this sense, I begin with Samantha Schweblin's 2014 novel called Fever Dream, which invites us to enter the dark ecology, or a kind of dark ecology, like the one referred by the authors from Dark Scenes from Damaged Art. The novel places us within a tangled web of haunting coexistence, difficult to fully grasp, through a story of contamination by agrochemicals used in soybean plantations. So if you could pass to the next slide, Eduardo, please. The narrative highlights the current climate crisis through a dialogue between two characters, Amanda, a woman vacationing with her daughter in rural Argentina, and David, a child suffering from poisoning that looms over the unnamed town in which they find themselves. So this green fields, the lush green fields chosen by the protagonist as the ideal setting for a peaceful getaway with her daughter, originally linked to Amanda's desire for contact with nature and tranquility. You can come back to the one, this one. So this place that Amanda think about as a place where she can be in touch with nature and tranquility soon lead us to a much darker dimension of Argentina countryside, which are the soybean fields, which transform the landscape into true sacrifice zones. And this term, sacrifice zones, is used usually by environmental justice movements to describe areas marked by dangerous facilities and projects responsible for environmental harm, which are typically located in economically disadvantaged regions of the world, could describe the setting chosen for this narrative as well. So, this slide, I'm going to get to it very soon, but just before that, this book, Fever Dream, draws on ghostly images from Latin America's past that continue to haunt the region, as well as a perception of what is different or divergent from the Western capitalist norm as something monstrous. Little by little, this novel reveals a growing sense of exhaustion, of a sudden annihilation of the future through the descriptions of the children in the village and with what happens to David and Nina. The understanding of this contaminated space is progressively built through the narrative, through Amanda's realization that what initially seemed strange about the region and its inhabitants is rooted in something much larger and far less supernatural than it first appears to be. And that's when I get into this book that Eduardo is showing you. So the discussion proposed by Annette Singh, Niels Boban, Elaine Gain, and Heather Swenson in this book called Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet opens an interesting dialogue with Schwebling's novel, as well as with the two other works analyzed in this presentation as well, by addressing the ghostly and monstrous presence of the Anthropocene. So this volume, it is composed. I don't know if you have the chance to read it. It's from 2017, and I highly recommend it. It's a very interesting book. This volume is composed of several essays that build a transdisciplinary conversation around the urgent challenge of our time. And these discussions, centered on the figures of ghosts and monsters, invite us to reflect on the entangled relationships we inhabit and the need for creative thinking, not only to confront the climate crisis, but also to find ways of living as well as possible amid the ruins of Anthropocene. So, according to the authors, every landscape is haunted by past ways of life. And the space visit by Amanda gradually revealed the consequences of Latin America's ongoing new colonialism. So the fields that initially offered peace and tranquility are soon unveiled as haunted spaces marked by both old and recent forms of violence experienced by the country, which have turned rural areas into vast monoculture zones. The present of the past, as the authors observe in Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, they are going to say that the present of the past unsettles us in its indeterminacy in certain point, which is precisely the ghostly quality they focus on. In the novel, we come to understand that these chemical compounds are responsible for triggering the death of animals and people, causing deformities in those who survive, as well as a range of disease and impoverishment of local population. This last aspect emerged through the ghostly image of Sotomayor Farm, which is the name of the farm that appears in the novel. And this farm seems to loom over the narrative without ever revealing its interior or its owner. All we know is that the soybean production from its land seems to be what turns the small town into a sacrifice zone, an aspect closely tied to the very history of the country where the story takes place. Because if we think about Argentina, since the 1990s, genetically modified soy has been introduced and its cultivation intensified, gradually replacing other traditional agricultural activities. And driven by financial crisis the country was facing back then in the 90s, They got under the pressure from multinational corporations to cultivate genetically modified soy. And the president back then, Carlos Menem, saw it as the only way to pay off the national debt. So this happened again in 2000 when they every time they have some kind of crisis and need to ask money for the international community, they ended up having to deal with this kind of imposition. So the promise that genetically modified crops would lead to economic growth and reduce rural poverty, however, has not materialized. Instead, the monopoly established in the country has only deepened rural poverty, restricting small farmers and forcing them into further debt in order to survive. In this book by Samantha Schweblin, one emblematic scene in this regard is Amanda's dream involving a can of peas, the processed product that, if we could pass the slide, please, now. Eduardo, thank you. In Fever Dream, there is one scene that Amanda dreams. Actually, it's not she's dreaming about her daughter and this boy, David, and in the dream appears a can of peas, and the processed product is described by the protagonist as something she would never buy. And then I quote the novel. It's a can of peas of a brand I don't buy, one I would never buy. They are bigger, much harder kind of peas than the one we eat, coarser and cheaper, a product I would never choose to feed my family with. She asks David, this character that is kind of leading her to this understanding of what is happening in the town, whether this detail in the dream matters in her attempt to understand what's causing the poisoning. And he promptly responds, it matters a lot. Well, if you could pass the slide again, Eduardo, to the next one. There is also one author, Paul Preciado, that I really like, that in Dysphoria Mundi, he's going to devote part of his reflection on the violent planetary transition that we are experiencing to substances that are eternal in sacrifice zones, that remind us of those contaminating the soil of this small unnamed rural town in Argentina that Schweblin is talking about. He states that the exposure of entire communities to these substances constitute institutional violence within a system governed by fossil capitalism, where more powerful countries can select territories to serve as dumping grounds for toxic waste, threatening the local population and the biodiversity of the area. So according to Preciado, and I quote him, the presence of whatever chemicals in the soil, water, and air allow us to speak not only of extractivism and of the industrial colonization of particular territories, but more radically of the construction of necrospaces, spaces of death where life is, if not impossible, at least toxic. These are the political and subjective conditions of possibilities of the present regime, the naturalization of poison and the aestheticization of pollution. Thus, the P in Schweblin's work emerges as a ghostly presence that remind us and remind the protagonist that the green fields of the rural town conceal violence that are, for the most part, silenced by institutions to ensure the continuation of practices necessary to maintain the system. This P reminds Amanda of the necrospaces scattered across global south, usually in rural and precarious regions, spaces where extractivist policies condemn the population to misery, disease, and normalize local suffering. It is the reality, it is this reality that constitutes the Anthropocene that emerged in Schweblin's work, where the intensification of violence against the planet itself, perpetrated mostly by the global north, produced dire and macabre consequences for the inhabitants of the world's less privileged zones, such as the town where Amanda finds herself. This threat, in turn, seems to transform the real into something increasingly strange, more spectral, as it is based on past actions carried out in the name of exceptionalism and progress. So I see that by constructing her story of ecological horror in Global South, Schweblin invites us to see the very narrative of the Anthropocene as a horror story. Or as Jeffrey Andrews Weinstock puts it, and I quote him, the Anthropocene as a Gothic meta-narrative, with a kind of framework that explore elements constituting the Gothic tradition, such as the locus horribilis, monstrous character, the ghostly past. This book, Fever Dream, narrates the violence of extractivist capitalist practices in Global South and the ghosts and monsters that emerge from this violence. However, I think it's interesting to note that the novel points out these monstrosities are not our own from Latin America, but they come from outside. Here, the locus horribilis is Latin America as a whole, where experiments and violence of the global north leave ghosts that seem to awaken and provoke a response from the earth to all violence perpetrated by capitalism. We could say the intrusion of Gaia, as Isabel Stengers calls it, creating local and singular monstrosities in response to the kind of devastation that these spaces endure. So from that, I moved to When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Lobatut, where he revisits the idea of Gaia's intrusion already present in its original title. In Spanish, the title of the book is Un verdor terrible, a terrible grain. Although this image is lost in the Portuguese and English translation, the work still engages with the idea throughout the narrative. This terrible greenness here refers to uncontrolled nature, a nature that could grow without limits if conditions allowed. And Eduardo, could you pass the slide, please? Okay, thank you. This vision of nature is not idealized, but rather presents nature as a tonic and monstrous figure, suggesting its untamable and brutal character. In this sense, according to Isabel Stengers, Gaia's brutality is proportional to the brutality inflicted upon her. However, it is important to keep in mind that Gaia doesn't act as a righter of wrongs. It seems clear that the region of the earth that will be affected first will be the poorest on the planet, to say nothing of all those living beings that have nothing to do with the affair. This indicates that the intrusion does not begin with the main perpetrators of brutality, but in the most vulnerable places in the world. For Stengers, this brutality is also inseparable from the kind of science that seems that actually sees development and progress as the only way forward. And to fight this, the philosophers tell us to be suspicious of this discourse. And questioning and distrust actually will predominate in Benjamin Labatut's novel. If you could pass the slide, please, Eduardo. This work, called When We Cease to Understand the World, is a work that will precisely question the paradox of science. In a way, Labatut's novel chooses to address the theme that is hidden in Schweblin's work, maybe I could say that, by focusing on the scientists who create substance that can later cause not only environmental damage, but also harm the local populations where they are used. It's like Labatut's book addresses the ghost of 20th century scientific advance, drawing a parallel with their effects in Latin America in its final part, an epilogue that is going to be called Night Gardener, which takes place in Chile. It is a work that reflects on the crisis of the Anthropocene, centering on science and the role of scientists in modern society. And Labatut challenges to think about how the physical, mathematical, chemical science shape the world we live in today and perpetuate an exceptionalist and progressive-driven logic, which is precisely what intensified the crisis of our time. This novel exposes a paradox, the fact that science cannot be seen as simply good or bad because it can be both simultaneously. Labatut begins the narrative with a genealogy of the color Prussian blue, and through stories of discoveries by accident, we are introduced to the world's first weapon of mass destruction, which is the chlorine gas used in the sorry about the noise. Used in World War I. In this chapter, he recounts the story of the Nobel Prize laureate Fritz.
Excuse me, Marina, your mic is silent. We lost last few seconds.
Oh my God, I don't
Now
know.
now it's okay. So I just lost a couple of seconds there. So sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Thank you, actually. I don't know exactly where I stopped talking.
You were talking about the Nobel laureate, and then
okay. The laureate Fitzhaber, right, which is known as the father of chemical warfare. And I was talking about, I don't know if you got this, but I was talking that he was the one that found a way in 1909 to convert nitrogen from the air into fertilizer, making the large-scale synthesis of ammonia and consequently making the fertilizer production possible. This innovation helped to feed millions of people by increasing agricultural productivity. And the novel indicates that, and I quote the novel, had it not been for Haber, hundreds of millions of people who until then had depended on natural fertilizers such as guano and saltpeter for their crops would have died from lack of nourishment. Beginning the discussion about the impacts that scientific discoveries will cause in the world. So with a blend of fiction and biography of famous scientists from the global north, Labatut's work scrutinized the logic of progress, discourses of exceptionalism, and their dangers. As mathematician Karl Schwarzschild points out in the second chapter of the narrative, let me just check. Okay, the quotation is here on the slide. We have reached the highest point of civilization. All that is left for us is to decay and fall. Throughout the narrative, we are invited to follow scientific discoveries and researchers who will be haunted by the monstrosity of their creations and leave traces as ghosts far beyond what their creators could have predicted. These traces permeate the narrative throughout the chapters, moving from the development of fertilizers to mathematicians like Mochizuki, who asserts that he's going to say in the narrative that it's not politicians who would end the planet, but scientists like them. The narrative talks about Grothendieck, another scientist who abandons everything in a critical instance against the use of science for armament purpose and withdraws from research in pursuit of a simpler life and community. So in a narrative that connects one invention or scientist with the next, when we cease to understand the world, brings a critique of the modern ways of thinking, emphasizing the relentless pursuit of continuous improvement in ways of life through rational thought. The work culminates finally in the awareness that this science, which promised to lead us to certain knowledge, ultimately led us to understand that what we have is uncertainty. We actually realized that we cannot comprehend anything, as the title of the Brazilian and English edition warn us. We live in a world of complexities completely opposed to the promise of certainty, final and objective truths that modern science once claimed. The work seems to suggest that the trail of destruction left by the discoveries explored in the narrative does not necessarily have to be inevitable. which is very interesting in this book. Understanding this uncertainty indicates that humanity may need a different attitude, both individually and collectively, towards the world and science. So in this book, one invention, it's like one invention haunts the one that follows until we reach the epilogue called Night Gardener, where we witness the repercussions of human actions in a small village near the Andes Mountains. It is as if all the ghosts of the previous discoveries narrated earlier were hovering over the space, haunting the locality and intertwining the history of knowledge with a history of horror. In this final chapter, there is even a shift in the narrative structure, now moving to first person, inviting us to witness the effects of the global North's discovery unfolding in Latin America, a place haunted by extractivist policies, as I tried to show in Fever Dream. The epilogue begins precisely by revisiting the first chapter of Labatut's work and the discovery of Prussian blue and arsenic, which now kills the dogs in the small village where the characters are located. But it also appears in the lake in the area that has not frozen for decades, ever since the climate warmed, and also in the soil of the narrator's house itself, which is composed of garbage. Could you pass to the next slide, Eduardo, please? And I quote the novel, "The former owner, the man who built the cabin and sold it to me, had to even out the terrain with rubble and construction debris, so that every now and then when I dig into the ground to plant flowers and trees, I find cans, bottle caps, and pieces of shredded plastics beneath the ground. In the city's soil, it is as if cultural history and natural history were intertwined. The soil layers in the narrator's yard accumulate a quantity of products that represent this very modern progress. We have cans, lids, plastic. They remain there as ghosts of the Anthropocene, like a memory of the capitalist production, which accumulates in the soil and promotes a kind of slow violence," quoting Rob Nixon, "which is built up gradually, almost imperceptibly, for the local population." In the final part of Labatut's work, it is interesting that the characters who appear are no longer European scientists, but rather a small community from Latin America. It's here that the results of progress become evident. With this image of the result of modern progress in Latin America, I'm going to move on to the analysis of the last work proposed in this presentation, that is The Substitutes by Bernard Carvalho, where we are also involved in violence and environmental degradation. So while Fever Dream tells the story through the narrative of a mother and a daughter, here in Bernard Carvalho we have the encounter between a father and a son, now in the Amazon forest, which emerges as a kind of background for the unfolding family story. The Substitutes is set during the Brazilian military dictatorship, and the father, a man in business with military officials connected to the government, is dealing wood from the forest with foreign groups. While the country undergoes these disturbing negotiations, the boy reads a science fiction novel called The Substitute, the same title of the novel, in which, after the end of the planet, a group of children chosen as special embarks on an exploratory space journey where they await the arrival of their families while building shelters. So, connected with the science fiction story, the novel is constructed from the boy's memories, inviting us to reflect on the tragedy happening in the country at the moment and to consider the horrors that seem to escape the nation's memory. So, seen as an enemy, when we think about the forest and the dictatorship in Brazil, the forest was seen as an enemy that prevented economic expansion. The Amazon rainforest during the Brazilian military dictatorship was also perceived as a possibility for profit, resulting in accelerated destruction of the country's vegetation and indigenous people. At least 8,000 indigenous people were killed during the construction of the Trans-Amazonian Highway alone, according to researcher Luis Marques, who emphasized that this number reflects documented deaths, but the actual number is likely much higher. The devastation documented in the Amazon is the result of a worldview shaped by war, typical of the military. Eduardo, if you could pass the slide, please. The Trans-Amazonian Highway was built during Médicis government here in Brazil, being yet another one of the military dictatorship's grandiose projects. The plan promised to cross Brazil from west to west, and despite remaining unfinished, generated significant money for politicians and high-ranking military officers through corruption, as revealed by Sudan's advertisements. And then here I brought one of the advertisements. We have a lot, but I just chose one that says in English, "Enough legends, let's make money." The horror story of the Amazon is connected in the novel to the colonization narrative found in the science fiction book the boy is reading, in which its protagonist is a boy without memory, a highly symbolic choice when talking about the Brazilian dictatorship. By drawing this parallel between the colonization in the science fiction book, and the extractivist practices in the Amazon in the Brazilian military dictatorship, Bernardo Carvalho's work questioned the modern narrative of progress, much like Schweblin's and Labatut's works. So the boy's lack of memory about the trip to the Amazon forest haunts him. He sees the place and the indigenous people he passes as ghosts that continue to follow him even as an adult. It is no coincidence that this character will become an anthropologist, as he himself says. If you could pass the next slide, please. I quote the novel, "He becomes an anthropologist as a challenge," he's going to say that, "as a challenge to my father, to forgetting, to the naturalness of indifference, or rather to forget him." It is as if the ghost of the March of Progress, and that is the military dictatorship slogan in Brazil, echoes through the country and shapes the relationship between father and son. The narrative blends the country's violent past with the construction of the boy's identity, who blames himself for his lack of interest in others. If you could pass to the next one, please, Eduardo. This boy realizes that he realized for the first time, and then I quote the novel, that he never knew the name of the indigenous people who lived on his father's farm. He never bothered to ask. He never cared. So the science fiction story resembles the boy's own experience, the father's foreign clients, the description of extractivist practices taking place in the Amazon forest, what the adults around him are talking about, suggesting what the future of the Amazon forest and also Brazil might be. In the story the boy reads, we discover that the children aboard the spaceship were clones sent to the substitute planet as guinea pigs, implanted with false memories to help them wait patiently and peacefully for the humans while they did all the work preparing the place to receive them. The protagonist without memory was the only one capable of destabilizing the plan. So the horror story revealed in the boy's favorite childhood book questions the horror of reality during the military dictatorship, something the boy does not even perceive, but the adults around him choose to ignore. And here I'm already heading to the end of my presentation. But this memory lapse portrayed by Carvalho is permeated by ghosts of brutality that haunts not only the relationship between father and son, but an entire country. It is the national horror for which we do not have enough information to construct a coherent narrative. We only have ghosts that pursue us and point us towards path we try to make sense of it all. Although it's still constructed based on the precepts of realist literature, the substitutes encounter horror in its lacunar writing, which reveals the impossibility of narrating the past due to a lack of national memory that, through its absence, produced ghosts and haunts the boy into adulthood. Thus, just like fever dream and when we cease to understand the world, Bernardo Carvalho's work can be understood as part of this current trend in Latin America literature to rely on negative poetics to narrate the horror of the Anthropocene. From different perspectives on our peripheral position in today's crisis, especially the climate crisis, the works of Schweblin, Labotut, and Carvalho invite us to reflect on Latin America as a place permeated by ghosts of extractivist practices resulting from a modern mindset rooted in a desire for progress that fails to consider the ethical implications. So I brought here some thoughts about 3 novels, and well, I hope we can talk a little bit more now, dialoguing, but this is what I had to present to you, this a reflection on this trend, this eco-horror trend in Latin America. And well, I thank you all for listening until the end. These are, we have here the references I used on my presentation.
Wow. Thank you very much for that very thoughtful, thought-provoking presentation, Marina. So now we open for questions and comments from the audience and from both of us as well. Let me just remove this so I can... Karina, I think you're...
Muted. Sorry, I was saying I had a question. Thank you so much, Marina. That was such an interesting and excellent paper. And thank you, Eduardo, again, for organizing all of the technical side of our seminar today. Yeah, there was so much to think about in that paper. But one of the things I was interested in, I thought you made a very clear case for the ways in which violence is historic and the legacy of violence. And I was thinking as you were talking, I guess, about those aspects and the material influences they have on people's different, and daily lives. What kind of struck me was how capitalism, colonialism, and so on can commit violence from a distance, so that they are removed from not only the consequences, but also in ways also the carrying out of this violence and this destruction on the landscape. And it seemed like the ghost is such a powerful metaphor, this idea of haunting for that, kind of continuing legacy. But when we were chatting before the talk began, you mentioned that you'd also looked a lot at eco literature from North America. And I wondered, I know it's not exactly the subject of your paper, but I wondered if you see a distinction between the way in which violence is represented in literature that you're familiar with from the global North, as differentiated in the kind of the literature that you've used as examples today.
That's a very interesting question, Karina. Thank you. Yeah, actually, we can see when we think about dystopias and post-apocalyptic novels from global North, and it came to my mind now, Octavia Butler, for instance. I was thinking about her, and she's talking about the corporations and the horror that population is suffering. I think it is kind of similar, but at the same time, it's very different, the horror from North America and the one that we experience in Latin America as literature, because it's like when we think about the corporations in Octavia Butler, for instance, it's something from the United States where the novel takes place, right? It's this country now is governed by corporations instead of politicians. Politicians are just like there. But when I started reading about Latin America's horrors and eco horrors, it seems that it always points to something out of our place, you know. It seems that this horror, this ghosts, they are not actually local. They come from other places. They are local in a sense that dictatorship happened in Argentina, happened in Brazil, and everything. But there is something in those books that tell us that it's not exactly just because of our country, but it's because something that is happening in the world. Like we know that dictatorships were highly how can I say that, they were seen as something that would help nations like United States when it happened in the 70s here. And they were they were somehow, I forgot the word in English, but patrocinados, Eduardo.
Sponsored.
Thank you. Sponsored by nations like United States. So even though we have those horrors happening here, I feel that Latin America's literature, this contemporary Latin America literature actually, points out that the horrors they actually come from something much bigger than we think. They come from a modern way of life and thinking, this logic of progress, exceptionalism, that are not actually just ours. You know, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I feel that this literature always points out something exterior. Like I didn't explore those 3 novels very well, and I don't know if you have read them, but I would just give an example of Samantha Schwebling's. I think it will actually make it more clear. In Schwebling's, we have this story that it seems like it's something supernatural at some point, because there is a boy who's contaminated with something. He was contaminated by something, and and his mother says that he's monstrous, that she had to take him to this woman who lived in this greenhouse, a kind of witch, a community witch, and this woman made something to his soul. She made a soul transmigration, and part of his soul went somewhere else, and something else came to his body. So we have this idea that the novel is supernatural. Yeah. But actually, as it progresses, we realize the poisoning that is happening and that happened to this boy is actually something a lot more real. It comes from the agrochemicals used in these farms that surround the city. And then we have this whole idea that those agrochemicals, it's not explored. Schwebling never says that in the novel, but we know that agrochemicals and corporations like Monsanto entered Argentina in the 90s and 20-somethings. Every time they have a crisis and they had to ask, help, monetary help, the Monetary International Fund declared that they needed to produce, import and export genetically modified soy. So we know that Argentina's countryside is full of this kind of plantations, which has a lot of agrochemicals and everything. So we know that we have ghosts that are local, but at the same time, this local is not actually local. It comes from the outside. I don't know if I'm being clear, but
yes, very, yeah.
In La Batut, we have the same thing, because the first part of the book, it's about scientists and those European scientists. It's kind of almost like a biography of those scientists. It's a very weird narrative. I don't know how to classify it very well. But the last part of the novel, it's a chapter, and then we have a narrative. We could say that. We have a chapter called Night Gardener, and then this part of the novel, it happens on Chile. And then we have all those chemicals that those scientists, European scientists, developed in the first part appears in the small town.
Yeah.
So we have this image that those ghosts and those monsters are not actually local. I guess I'm still starting this research, but that's what I could grasp.
Well, thank you. That's a really illuminating answer to that question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what I see, that it's different, I would say, from North America.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking about that because on the one hand, we have this, let's say, Gothic presence of ghosts that, taking the trend from the global north, always point towards a colonial past. They always point toward the past. They always point towards the past. What happens that I see in the global south is that, well, two things. First, I think that if there's one thing that we in the global south are better than our counterparts in the global north, is how we have had to learn to deal with daily tragedies on a daily basis, and now we just have this other global planetary scope of tragedies, but for us it's like Tuesday, something we have been dealing with for a longer time. And in that sense, it kind of also has to do with, in the case of Brazil itself, with the lack of an understanding, or even, I wouldn't say reconciliation, but an understanding of our colonial past, which in a way kind of points towards the differences that we have in the narratives that you have mentioned here. If you see in Argentina, it's clear that their ghosts are different to ours, even though they are global southern ghosts. Argentinian ghosts point towards a different way of dealing, for example, with how they've established a reconnection with the history, the recent history of their dictatorship, the rescue of not just history, but every person or every single person that's disappeared, with the orphans that have been forcefully adopted by the military, and so on and so forth. While we're mentioning, and by the way, thank you for bringing that novel by Bernardo Carlo. I haven't read it. I just while we were speaking, I just bought it through Amazon. But it reminded me of Werner Herzog's Fitzcarraldo, the movie that presents that kind of grandiose attempt of domesticating the environment, domesticating the Amazon, domesticating the forest, led by political interests that are not necessarily the ones that govern us, but the ones that somehow we have to deal with the outcomes nowadays. So I was wondering, Marina, if you could comment a little bit about this necessity, perhaps, of differentiating the many global souths, differentiating the ways in which these Gothic ghosts appear in different instances, perhaps in Latin American fiction, because the Chilean experience is closer to the Argentinian experience with the dictatorship, which is far from how we have managed to deal with in terms of, an ample form of amnesty in which let's not talk about it and let's pretend that everything is fine. So if you could, just comment a little bit about it, because I'm curious to see what you have to say.
Yeah, for sure, we have different experience in Latin America. That's for sure. We dealt with dictatorship governments in a different way. Bernardo Carvalho here is very interesting because he talks about our lack of memory, because we never actually dealt with what happened. We simply, as a country, as a nation, we forgot about it. We never punished anyone. And his book is very interesting in the sense because we have this boy without a memory, which is the narrative inside the narrative. We have a character reading a science fiction novel in the novel, right? So we have this character without a memory, and the boy who is like in the main narrative also having trouble to remember his past with his father, right? So we have this, I think this is the first difference that we have from Brazil and Argentina and Chile. In Brazil, we have this difficult of making sense because we don't remember. We have all these stories of bodies that were hidden in the Amazon forest, and the family of those people trying to look for them and everything. So we have this big gap in our history, I would say, that we cannot make sense, and this narrative is dealing with that. And for sure, Argentina we have different violence, because when we think about global South and I was reading this week, I had to teach a class and we were working with Silvia Federici. And I was reading one of her latest essays, and she was talking about how in the 70s, when capitalists had this setback, they ended up finding ways to kind of continue this system by recolonizing other countries like the global South. And then we have this coming in different ways. We have, you just said about the forest, right? We have in Brazil this domestication of the forest, the Amazon forest, led by political interests. We have Argentina becoming kind of like this little farm where they can plant modified, genetic seeds. We have different kind of violence being inflicted in each of the countries, and of course, this will lead to different kind of narratives. Chile has was very influenced by this neoliberal, ideology and everything. So each of this country will deal. We have Uruguay. If we think about Fernanda Trias and the novel Mugre Rosa, we have like different kinds of violence. But actually, for this presentation, I just tried to think about the ghosts, but they are different, right? I was talking about the ghosts of Europe in Labatut, the ghosts of modified soybean plantations, the ghosts of this government, this dictatorship government that was never really, how can I say, punished for their crimes, and this lack of memory from the country. They are all different in some sense, but we are dealing with ghosts.
Yeah, but the I think the point is to what past are these ghosts pointing? If we have a lack of memory, a constructed lack of memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're pointing not to the past, but to the present, to the necessity of readdressing the present, right? Unlike the Argentinian, Chilean, even Uruguayan social cultures that have somehow, because you mentioned Trias' distinct line, which is in a way of addressing that
okay.
past.
I got what you meant. Like in Brazil, our ghost would be the present ghost.
Right.
Thinking about that. But I see in Bernardo Carvalho not about the present, the necessity of understanding. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening. The necessity of understanding the past, actually. Mm-hmm. The ghost is like this thing that they cannot see. It's not very clear as it is in the other ones. The ghost is something very diffuse and difficult to grasp, but it's talking about the necessity of understanding that past. The indigenous people, the boy saw, but never asked, never cared to ask which tribe they were from. Those little details that he tries to understand, but he cannot make it a complete story. It's about remembering and what happened. Of course, it's something we do on the present, but it's also trying to remember little pieces, trying to connect the pieces are there in the past. I don't know if
No, you did, and I think that in a way kind of connects to my idea, or not mine, but this general idea that Brazil does not belong to Latin America. That we have a different way of seeing ourselves linguistically, socially, culturally, geographically, that refuses to connect to even those paradigms of looking at the past, right?
Yeah, but I think that's changing, don't you think?
I think slowly, yeah, but
I think we are accepting that we are Latin Americans. And even in literature, we can see that Latin America, besides Brazil, they always had this very strong tradition in fantastic literature, realismo fantástico, right? In Brazil, we never had it. Our literature was always realistic, like in European patterns. Like we read Zola, Balzac, and we wanted to be that in Brazil. And now we have this whole movement of writers dealing with the fantastic and this this horror, or I don't know, dystopic. We have a lot of dystopic novels lately. So I think we are starting to see I don't know. This is just like I haven't researched very deeply about that. I know that we have always seen ourselves as different, as not Latin America, especially because of the language. But I think there is a change, a cultural change. We can see a lot of clothes and T-shirts Latinas lately, and things like that. That culturally, I think it's changing. That we are seeing ourselves as Latin more than we used to.
Hopefully for the best.
Hopefully, but that's just like something that I have been realizing, especially because of fashion. I have seen this week I went to a store. I needed to buy something, and I saw like 3 or 4 Renner, it's a big department store here, with Latinas and things like that written on it. Latinas do it better and things like that. On it. So I think we are, and in literature I can see that there is something changing. I don't know if it's for the better, for the worse. I don't know if it's something steady, or I don't know if it's something just, I don't know, but I think we might be changing.
Okay, well, the idea that, well, we're again connected by tragedy now perhaps forces us
perhaps I think this might be the greatest link, because in all those works that I was all those books that I was talking about today, they are all linked by tragedy. That's it. You said before that we know how to deal with tragedies because we have tragedies all the time happening here since the Portuguese came to the country. We have in Brazil we have tragedies happening here, so we understand how to deal with that, and maybe that's what's connecting us with the other Latin America's countries. Maybe, I don't know. That's a suspicion I have, that we are somehow connecting because of our past horrors, past ghosts, and things like that.
So a kind of collective or shared experience of a particular type of trauma. I guess that's suggesting.
That's it, Karina. This shared trauma we all have. I think
it's interesting what you're saying about Brazil and the kind of exceptionalism or disconnection from the rest, Latin America. And it always seemed to me that Argentina has been a little bit in that boat as well. It's kind of tended to see itself as, well, certainly for a period of time, was one of the most affluent countries in South America, the continent, and really look to European art traditions in, kind of design, architecture, film, literature, visual art, that kind of thing. But I guess would still see themselves as quite distinct from Brazil.
Yeah, for sure. For sure they do. Argentinians, they see that it's not like we see ourselves as a collective whole, but I think we are seeing some points, some, as you said, some shared traumas that we have that can connect us. But still, we are very different. Actually, from I was talking now, and I was thinking about the fact that me and Eduardo, we live in the south, and here we are almost in Uruguay. We are very close to Uruguay and Argentina, and the north experience what we live very differently. So, but I think we somehow have this connection now, maybe because of this crisis, this climatic crisis of we are experiencing some kind of trauma that we are realizing that we all share, but for sure we see ourselves as distinct, and even those books they talk about traumas very distinctively.
Yeah.
But also, Marina, just one final comment. I mean, you were talking about the tradition of magical realism in South America and how we somehow are discovering or rediscovering it now. I was just remembering because there's I think that it's by Miguel José Oviedo who wrote a history of Latin American fiction, like 7, 8 volumes. It's a monstrous work. And I remember that on his chapter on magical realism, he discusses this trend in Latin America, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And I think his words are a trend that deals with a return to a sense of indigeneity, right? That reconnects to, again, to a past, but a past that is not a past that lives in the present. And then we can go back to, for example, how Chile, Bolivia, Peru, even Argentina somehow, to a lesser extent, have dealt with the presence of indigenous peoples and how we have dealt with the presence of indigenous peoples, or not dealt, or just exterminated them. And perhaps that is a way of thinking also how the difference in ghosts may have to do, because we are having to perhaps forcibly face these ghosts rather than artistically face these ghosts, in terms of artistic and literary constructions.
Yeah, for sure. We have this very strong difference in how we dealt with those indigenous people, and we in Brazil, we are actually being forced to deal with that now, which is great, actually. Which is something great. And this is when you asked me about the present, that Brazil always kind of seems to want to forget this past, but it seems now that we are being reminded of that constantly. We just had here Bolsonaro was convicted, and that somehow led us to this idea that we have to go back and we have to punish the ones that did something wrong, and we have to. This somehow led us to review the dictatorship time and the indigenous fights and everything. We are being forced in a good way because this is great actually for the country to look at those things that we always try to ignore.
And I agree. I just fear that because it's led by a partisan effort rather than a social effort, that we might,
Yeah.
eventually go back to the old days of just not thinking about it.
And you are very pessimistic.
I've been trying not to be, but
I'm more hopeful maybe. But yeah. But this is also very interesting. You were talking about the indigenous people, and I was thinking about about the verdor terrible in the title of Labatut. Also, we have this whole different image, maybe from the nature, coming from there, because this terrible greenness is not this idealized place when we see like a lot of green places, but it's a place that is also very monstrous because it can get a life of its own and finish us. It's like the Gaia's intrusion from Isabel Stengers, which is a very interesting idea in South America too, because this year I went to the Amazon forest for the first time, and actually when you see nature, it's not something peaceful and pleasant. It's actually very scary. You see the water and the river and the animals, and you get scared because it's very potent. It's powerful. It's different from this idealized image of the green. This is another thing that I kind of think it's interesting, especially in Labatut.
We get scared because we have no control over it, right?
Exactly. Losing control of. We have this. We are sure that we cannot control that. Nature is not controllable the way that we thought before, right? This is also appearing somehow. It appears in Labatut, and I think it's very interesting, this idea of not being able to control nature.
Okay. So do you have any other questions from the audience? Karina, would you like to make any other comments?
Well, I was thinking about the taming of nature, control of nature, as being also a major component of colonialism. I mean, it was part of the project, wasn't it? This is how you conquered lands, is that you could show that these was territory you controlled, but then you took places. So where I'm from, Australia, this was a place colonized by Britain, a landscape very different to the one that people came from. And so the nature was dangerous. You could die, there were floods, extreme weather, fires, all this kind of thing. And so much of literature, film, this kind of imagining of this colonization or settler period of Australia deals with this triumph over nature, to bring it into some kind of under control, to cut down the trees and grow crops and this kind of thing. And it seems like climate change perhaps transposes another kind of the uncontrollability of nature, but in a different guise, but still not. We can't bend nature to our human will.
Yeah, because it will get back to us, right? In this sense, not as a revenge, but just as a consequence, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And Australia has this thing in common with us, I guess, with the nature. We always see like those weird animals in Australia that can kill you. We see it, and it's kind of, it's this idea that it's uncontrollable, and it will get back. We are seeing floods, and we are seeing already everything that we feared happening.
And I suppose also in a metaphorical sense, nature as possessing, therefore, a life force in a sense of its own.
Yeah.
That is also, ghosts possess a certain metaphorical life force and continuity, don't they?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you. It has this metaphorical instance.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
Well, okay. So, since you have no questions we have lots of very nice comments about your talk, Madam. So again, thank you very much for this very thought-provoking conversation and presentation. And so I'll just re-extend the invitation for the third session now, which is going to be on November the 6th at the same time. And we will have the honor to have a talk by our own Marina, who will, give us her talk, and I'm sure it will be very interesting to hear as well. So for everyone watching us, thank you very much for watching us, and we'll meet again in 3 weeks' time for the third session of the seminar, Environmental and Human Futures in the Age of the Anthropocene. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you.